My girlfriend publicly shamed me everywhere for being too cheap and called me a pathetic boyfriend. So, I dumped her publicly. My girlfriend Tiffany shames me everywhere when I don't buy the things she likes, announcing to strangers that I'm too cheap to treat her properly and she deserves better than a boyfriend who won't spoil her. At the mall, she'll loudly tell salespeople that I'm the reason she can't have nice things because I refuse to buy her the designer bag she points out, even though I make decent money as an electrician. She'll stand in the middle of stores crying that all her friends' boyfriends buy them jewelry weekly, while I act like spending money on her is painful. She actually tells random women in restaurants that they're lucky their men value them enough to pay for expensive meals, while she has to suffer with someone who suggests splitting the check. When I bought her roses from the grocery store for Valentine's Day, instead of the $100 bouquet from the fancy florist, she left them on the restaurant table and told our waiter I didn't think she was worth real flowers. She took pictures of the abandoned roses and sent them to her group chat, saying this was what dating a cheapskate looked like. She'll compare me to her friends' boyfriends in front of everyone, listing the expensive gifts they receive while pointing out that I gave her a handmade birthday card instead of jewelry. She actually keeps a spreadsheet on her phone of everything her friends' boyfriends buy them and shows it to me weekly to demonstrate how far behind I am in the boyfriend rankings. At her sister's engagement party, Tiffany announced that she'd never have a nice ring like that, because I believed love shouldn't cost money. She told her entire family I was the reason she couldn't keep up with her social circle, and they all looked at me with pity and disappointment. She said real men understood that providing meant buying whatever their girlfriend wanted without questions or budgets. When I tried explaining I was saving for our future apartment, she said I was making excuses for being stingy, and future plans didn't matter if she was unhappy in the present. That's when I decided Tiffany needed to experience what public shaming about money really felt like. I started by loudly discussing her spending habits everywhere we went. At dinner with friends, I'd mention how Tiffany spent $300 on face cream while complaining we couldn't afford vacations. I'd tell waiters she insisted on the most expensive wine while contributing nothing to our bills. At the mall, I'd inform salespeople that Tiffany expected gifts, but hadn't bought me anything in 2 years, not even a birthday card. When she dragged me shopping, I'd tell other customers in line that she'd maxed out 3 credit cards on clothes she wore once, while expecting me to cover all our living expenses. Next, I started comparing Tiffany to my friends' girlfriends in front of everyone. I'd list how Jake's girlfriend cooked him dinner nightly, while Tiffany ordered takeout on my card. I'd mention how Tom's girlfriend surprised him with thoughtful homemade gifts, while Tiffany only cared about price tags. I'd point out how Bill's girlfriend worked 2 jobs to contribute equally, while Tiffany quit her part-time job because working was too stressful. I created my own spreadsheet showing how much my friends' girlfriends contributed to relationships versus taking and showed it to anyone who'd look. At her friend's birthday, I announced that Tiffany couldn't afford a real gift because she'd spent all her money on herself again. I told everyone about the $400 shoes she'd bought herself the day before, while giving her friend a card she'd stolen from my desk drawer. I explained to the whole party that Tiffany believed relationships meant men paying for everything, while women just existed beautifully. Her friends started noticing the pattern of Tiffany demanding expensive gifts while never reciprocating. The real satisfaction came when I started refusing to pay for anything in the most public way possible. When restaurant bills came, I'd loudly announce I was only paying for my food because Tiffany had shamed me for not buying her a designer purse that morning. I'd tell the confused waiter the whole story while Tiffany sat there mortified. At movie theaters, I'd buy 1 ticket and tell the cashier my girlfriend thought I was too cheap anyway, so she could buy her own. When she couldn't pay, I'd explain to everyone in line that she'd spent all her money on makeup while expecting me to cover entertainment. During a double date, when the bill arrived, I announced that since Tiffany had told everyone at lunch that I was a pathetic provider, she could provide for herself tonight. I paid for my meal and our friends' meals, but left Tiffany's portion unpaid. Tiffany sits frozen at the table while Jax and Chloe stare at their plates in uncomfortable silence. The waiter stands there holding the bill with obvious confusion about what to do next. I feel a rush of satisfaction seeing Tiffany's face turn red as she realizes I actually left her portion unpaid in front of our friends. The manager appears and asks if there's a problem with the check. I calmly explain that my portion and my friend's portions are covered, but my girlfriend needs to handle her own meal. The manager nods slowly and looks at Tiffany with raised eyebrows. Tiffany's hands shake as she grips the edge of the table. Her designer purse sits right next to her chair where I can see it. The manager waits patiently while other diners at nearby tables start to notice the scene. Tiffany finally speaks, and her voice shakes as she tells the manager she doesn't have her wallet with her. I know it's a lie because I saw her designer purse sitting right next to her chair. The manager suggests she could run to an ATM or use a payment app while we wait. Tiffany's eyes fill with tears of rage and humiliation. Jax quietly offers to cover Tiffany's portion just to end the awkward scene. I tell him not to, because Tiffany needs to learn that actions have consequences. The manager shifts his weight from foot to foot and glances back toward the kitchen. Other servers have stopped to watch what's happening. Tiffany suddenly stands up and grabs her purse. She fumbles through it before slamming her credit card on the table. She tells the manager to charge the whole thing to her card. She turns to me with genuine hatred in her eyes. She says I'm a cruel, petty man who just humiliated her for the last time. She pays her portion, grabs her coat, and storms out of the restaurant without another word to anyone at the table. The door slams behind her hard enough that the windows rattle. The manager picks up her card and walks away to process the payment. Jax and Chloe both look at me like I just kicked a puppy. Jax quietly asks if I really needed to take it that far in front of them. I start explaining about all the times Tiffany humiliated me publicly. I list every restaurant and store where she called me cheap and pathetic. I tell them about the grocery store roses she left on the table. I remind them about the engagement party where she announced I'd never buy her a nice ring. Chloe interrupts and says she understands Tiffany was wrong. She says what I just did felt mean in a different way. She tells me she's uncomfortable about the whole situation. The manager returns with Tiffany's card and receipt. He places them on the table without making eye contact. Jax signs his portion of the check, and Chloe won't look at me. We leave the restaurant in awkward silence. I drive home alone, feeling a weird mix of satisfaction and emptiness. I replay Tiffany's face when she realized I actually wasn't going to pay. My phone starts blowing up with texts from Dakota calling me every name in the book. She says Tiffany is at her apartment crying. I turn my phone off because I don't want to deal with Tiffany's friends right now. I pour myself a drink to celebrate finally standing up for myself. The apartment feels quiet and empty. I sit on my couch and stare at the wall. The satisfaction I felt at the restaurant is already fading into something else. I turn my phone back on to check the time and see 20 more messages. I turn it off again and finish my drink. The next morning, I wake up to 17 missed calls and 32 text messages from various people in our social circle. Most of them are from Tiffany's friends calling me abusive and controlling. A few are from mutual friends asking for my side of the story. I text back a simple explanation that Tiffany spent months publicly shaming me about money. I tell them I showed her what that actually felt like. Some people respond right away with support, others don't respond at all. I get ready for work and try to focus on normal things. I go to work and Vladimir notices I'm in a weird mood. I tell him the whole story over lunch about the revenge campaign and last night's restaurant incident. Vladimir listens without interrupting. He asks me a question I wasn't expecting. He wants to know if humiliating Tiffany actually made me feel better, or just made me feel like her. I get defensive and insist it's different because she started it. I tell him I was just giving her a taste of her own medicine. Vladimir shakes his head and takes another bite of his sandwich. He doesn't say anything else, but I can tell he thinks I'm wrong. Tiffany calls me from Dakota's phone around 2 in the afternoon. When I answer, she's clearly been crying, but her voice is hard and angry. She says I'm a vindictive asshole who planned this whole revenge campaign just to destroy her publicly. She says she never wants to see me again. I tell her that's fine with me since she spent our entire relationship making me feel worthless. I say we can both move on with our lives now. She hangs up without saying goodbye. I sit at my desk staring at my phone screen. That evening, Jax shows up at my apartment with beer. He says we need to talk about what happened at dinner. He tells me he's been my friend for 10 years, and he's never seen me act cold like that before. He says he's worried I turned into someone mean. I defend myself by pulling up all the screenshots I took of Tiffany's group chat messages. I show him where she trashed me to her friends and showed off her spreadsheet ranking me against other boyfriends. Jax looks through the messages carefully. He scrolls through every screenshot I saved. He admits Tiffany was definitely toxic and materialistic. He says fighting toxicity with more toxicity just made me toxic too. He asks if I actually feel good about what I did, or if I'm just telling myself I should feel good because she deserved it. I don't have a good answer for that. We sit in silence drinking beer while I try to figure out what I'm actually feeling. Over the next few days, my phone kept buzzing with messages from different people in our friend group. Some of them thought I did the right thing standing up to Tiffany after months of her treating me like garbage. Others thought I went way too far with the whole revenge thing and made it worse than it needed to be. I could tell people were picking sides and it made everything feel even more awkward. Chloe sent me a private text saying she got why I was mad at Tiffany, but the restaurant situation made her really uncomfortable. She said it felt planned out and mean instead of just being angry in the moment. I texted back that Tiffany's behavior was planned and mean too, and I just wanted her to know what it felt like to be embarrassed like that in public. Chloe didn't respond right away, and I wondered if I was losing friends over this whole mess. I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw Dakota post something vague about toxic masculinity and financial abuse. She didn't mention my name, but it was obviously about me. A bunch of Tiffany's friends commented with heart emojis and supportive messages saying things like, "You deserve better," and "Real men don't act like that." I wanted to screenshot all the evidence I had of Tiffany's behavior and post it in the comments to defend myself. My finger hovered over the comment button while I thought about all the group chat messages where Tiffany trashed me to her friends. Vladimir sent me a text right then, warning me not to get into a social media war because it would just make everything worse for everyone. He said fighting online never solved anything and would just give people more reasons to pick sides. I listened to him and didn't comment, but I took screenshots of Dakota's post and all the comments anyway. I saved them in a folder on my phone in case I needed to show people later what I was dealing with from Tiffany's side of things. My phone rang a few days later and I saw it was Willow calling. I almost didn't answer because I figured she was calling to yell at me for what I did to her sister. I picked up anyway, and she said she needed to talk to me about what happened at her engagement party and everything after. She told me she felt uncomfortable when Tiffany announced in front of everyone that I'd never buy her a nice ring like the one Kirk got Willow. She said it was awkward and put everyone in a weird position during what was supposed to be a happy celebration. But then she said my revenge campaign crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and both Tiffany and I were wrong in different ways. Willow said she hoped we could both learn something from this whole mess and move on with our lives separately. I told her I understood where she was coming from, and I was sorry the drama affected her engagement party. She said she appreciated that and hung up after wishing me well. The weekend came and I spent it alone in my apartment trying to figure out what I was actually feeling about everything. I kept replaying that moment at the restaurant when Tiffany realized I wasn't going to pay for her meal. The satisfaction I felt watching her scramble to find her credit card was already starting to fade into something else. I sat on my couch staring at nothing and feeling this weird, empty feeling in my chest. Maybe I just became the thing I hated instead of being better than her. I pulled up the spreadsheet I made comparing Tiffany to my friends' girlfriends and looked at all the entries I'd carefully tracked. Seeing it laid out like that made me realize how small and calculated the whole thing was. Tiffany did the same thing to me first with her spreadsheet, but that didn't make mine any less petty. I closed the app and threw my phone on the couch cushion next to me. Monday morning, I went to work still feeling off about everything. I was wiring a circuit in a new construction site, and my mind kept wandering back to the breakup and the revenge campaign. I connected 2 wires wrong and didn't notice until my supervisor came over to check my work. He caught the mistake before anything dangerous happened, but he pulled me aside after. He asked if something was going on in my personal life because I was usually way more careful than this. I gave him the short version of the breakup and told him about the public shaming and the revenge and how it all blew up at that restaurant. My supervisor listened and didn't say much until I finished talking. Then he told me revenge might feel good when you're doing it, but it usually leaves everyone feeling like crap afterward. He said he learned that lesson the hard way in his own life and wished someone had told him sooner. I nodded and thanked him for catching my mistake before someone got hurt. My phone buzzed that afternoon with a text from Tiffany's actual number instead of Dakota's phone. She asked if we could meet up to talk about dividing our stuff since we both had things at each other's apartments. I stared at the message for a few minutes before responding. I agreed to meet at a coffee shop that was halfway between our places because I didn't want her coming to my apartment and I didn't want to go to hers. The texts we sent back and forth were cold and businesslike, nothing like how we used to talk when things were good between us. We set a time for the next day, and I put my phone away feeling weird about seeing her again. I got to the coffee shop early and ordered a drink while I waited. Tiffany walked in 15 minutes later looking tired with red puffy marks under her eyes from crying. It was the first time since I started the whole revenge thing that I actually felt guilty about what I did. She sat down across from me without saying hi and pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse. She slid it across the table, and I saw it was a handwritten list of all my stuff at her place and all her stuff at my place. Her handwriting was neat and careful, like she'd spent time making sure everything was organized. We went through the list together, discussing when and how we'd exchange everything. We talked about our belongings like we were strangers doing a business deal instead of 2 people who used to date. Neither of us brought up anything personal or tried to talk about the relationship. We finished going through the list and both stood up to leave. Tiffany suddenly stopped and asked me why I had to embarrass her so publicly instead of just breaking up with her privately like a normal person would. I told her she embarrassed me publicly for months, and I wanted her to understand how that actually felt. I said maybe she'd think twice before treating her next boyfriend like a walking ATM machine. She looked at me for a long moment and then said I was right that she was wrong about the public shaming. But she said what I did was planned out and cruel in a way her behavior never was. She said we were both terrible people who brought out the worst in each other, and maybe we should just accept that. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. We walked out of the coffee shop and went to our separate cars without saying goodbye. That conversation stuck in my head for days afterward. I kept thinking about how Tiffany actually admitted she was wrong, which was something she never did once during our entire relationship. I started wondering if my revenge campaign stopped her from really learning anything, because now she could focus on what I did wrong, instead of looking at her own behavior. Vladimir told me I was thinking about it too much when I brought it up at lunch. He said toxic people rarely change anyway, and I shouldn't waste energy worrying about whether Tiffany learned her lesson. But I couldn't shake this feeling that I missed a chance to be the bigger person and just walk away without all the revenge stuff. Jax texted me asking if I wanted to come over and hang out with him and Chloe at their place. I could tell it was partly them checking on me to see how I was doing after the breakup. I drove over and they had pizza waiting and a game on the TV. We ate and watched, and it almost felt normal, except they were being really careful not to mention Tiffany or relationships at all. The game went to commercial, and Chloe turned to me and asked directly if I regretted how things ended. I thought about it for a second and told her honestly that I regretted the relationship, but I wasn't sure yet if I regretted the revenge part. Jax and Chloe looked at each other and then back at me, but neither of them said anything else about it. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about all the hours I spent planning my revenge campaign against Tiffany. I'd sit at work during lunch breaks making notes about her spending habits instead of just eating and relaxing like a normal person. I'd screenshot her group chat messages late at night when I should have been sleeping, building my case against her like some kind of prosecutor preparing for trial. I made that stupid spreadsheet comparing her to my friends' girlfriends and spent an entire Saturday afternoon filling in all the details and making sure the formatting looked professional. I coordinated my public attacks to happen at the exact moments when they'd cause maximum embarrassment, timing my announcements at restaurants and stores for when the most people would be around to witness her humiliation. All that mental energy and planning could have gone into just breaking up with her and moving on with my life. I could have used those hours to work on my electrician certification, hang out with friends, or literally anything productive instead of plotting revenge like some villain in a bad movie. The worst part was realizing I chose to drag things out and make both of us miserable when I could have just ended it cleanly. I wasted weeks of my life on petty revenge, and now I felt stupid and small sitting with that knowledge. A few days later, I got a text from someone named Anita, who I knew from our mutual friend group but hadn't talked too much. She said she wanted to hear my side of the story because she'd only heard Tiffany's version through Dakota and other friends. I agreed to meet her for coffee because I was tired of people only knowing half the story. We met at a coffee shop near my work, and I brought my phone loaded with all the evidence I'd been collecting. I showed Anita the screenshots of Tiffany's group chat messages where she trashed me to her friends and called me cheap and pathetic. I pulled up the photos Tiffany took of the grocery store roses I bought her and the messages she sent making fun of them. I showed Anita the spreadsheet Tiffany kept on her phone ranking me against other boyfriends based on how much money they spent on their girlfriends. Anita scrolled through everything with her eyes getting wider and wider. She looked through the messages where Tiffany complained about me suggesting we split checks at restaurants and the ones where she told her friends I was too stingy to buy her the things she deserved. Anita set my phone down and said she had no idea Tiffany was doing all that stuff. She said Tiffany always acted like the victim in their friend group, telling everyone how badly I treated her without mentioning any of her own behavior. Anita said now she understood why I snapped and started my revenge campaign, and she felt bad for judging me based only on what she'd heard from Tiffany's side. Anita's validation felt good at first, but then it started feeling hollow and empty. I sat there drinking my coffee and realized her understanding didn't change the fact that I chose to handle the situation in the worst possible way. Yeah, Tiffany was wrong for publicly shaming me and keeping that boyfriend ranking spreadsheet, but I was also wrong for planning out a calculated revenge campaign instead of just ending the relationship. Anita told me that several people in our friend group were privately sympathetic to me, but didn't want to get involved in the drama publicly because it felt too messy and uncomfortable. She said Jax had told some people about the evidence I showed him, and they felt bad for me, but also thought my revenge went too far. I realized I'd put our mutual friends in this terrible position where they felt like they had to choose sides between me and Tiffany. That wasn't fair to them because they were just trying to maintain friendships with both of us without getting dragged into our toxic mess. I thanked Anita for reaching out and left the coffee shop feeling worse than when I arrived. A week later, Jax texted me saying he had a box of my stuff from Tiffany's apartment that Dakota had dropped off at his place. He said Tiffany had a similar box of her stuff from my apartment that she wanted back. We arranged for me to swing by Jax's place to do the exchange so Tiffany and I wouldn't have to see each other. I drove over and carried the box of Tiffany's things inside, while Jax brought out the box of my stuff. Going through that box made me sad in a way I didn't expect. There was the coffee mug I always used at her place, the blue one with the chip on the handle that she said reminded her of me. My hoodie was folded neatly at the bottom, the gray one I'd leave there for cold nights when we'd watch movies on her couch. There was a framed photo of us from when we first started dating, both of us smiling at some restaurant during those early months when everything was good and easy. I picked up the photo and looked at our happy faces and felt this wave of sadness wash over me. I carried the box out to my car and threw the photo in the trash can by Jax's driveway. I got in my car and started driving home, but only made it 2 blocks before I turned around. I went back and fished the photo out of the trash because destroying it felt too dramatic and final, like I was trying too hard to prove I was over everything. At work the following week, I finally started getting back to normal and focusing on my job instead of obsessing over the breakup. I was running wire through a commercial building and actually felt present in what I was doing instead of mentally replaying arguments with Tiffany. Vladimir came by during lunch and we sat in his truck eating sandwiches. He told me he was proud of me for not escalating things further on social media or through friends. He said he'd been worried I'd post all that evidence publicly or start some big online war with Tiffany, but I'd shown restraint. Vladimir said he thought I was handling the aftermath better than I handled the actual breakup, which was progress. I told him I was just tired of the whole situation and ready to move on with my life. I said I still didn't know if I learned the right lessons from everything that happened, and Vladimir laughed and said most people never figure that out anyway. 2 days later, I ran into Dakota at the grocery store in the produce section. We both froze when we saw each other, and I could tell she wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if she should. I grabbed some apples and started to walk away, but she called my name. Dakota walked over and stood there fidgeting with her shopping basket. Finally, she said that Tiffany had been a mess since the breakup, and maybe I should reach out to check on her. I told Dakota that Tiffany and I were done, and there was no point in reaching out. I said checking on her would just give false hope or start another fight, and neither of us needed that. I told Dakota she should focus on being a good friend to Tiffany instead of trying to get us back together, because that ship had sailed and sunk. Dakota looked hurt, but nodded and walked away toward the dairy section. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Dakota said. I sat on my couch wondering if Tiffany was genuinely struggling or if Dakota was just trying to make me feel guilty. I grabbed my phone and looked at Tiffany's Instagram for the first time since the breakup. She'd posted several sad quotes about toxic relationships and betrayal, the kind of vague posts that are clearly about someone specific. One said something about how the person you love can become the person who hurts you most. Another was about recognizing red flags you ignored because you wanted to believe in someone. Part of me wanted to reach out and make sure she was okay, but the smarter part of my brain knew that would be a huge mistake. Reaching out would just restart the whole cycle of drama and hurt, and we'd end up right back where we started. I closed Instagram and put my phone away. The next day, Jax called me and said Chloe had run into Tiffany at the mall. I asked if there was drama, and Jax said no, but Tiffany had asked how I was doing. That surprised me because I figured Tiffany completely hated me after everything that happened. Jax said Tiffany told Chloe she'd been thinking about how materialistic she was during our relationship. Apparently, Tiffany was wondering if her behavior pushed me to react the way I did with the whole revenge campaign. I was shocked that Tiffany was actually doing some self-reflection instead of just blaming everything on me. I told Jax I was doing the same thing, thinking about my revenge campaign and whether it was justified or just cruel. Jax said maybe we were both growing from the experience, which would be the only good thing to come out of the whole mess. That conversation with Jax stuck in my head for the rest of the week. I decided to write Tiffany a letter saying what I couldn't say in person. I wanted to tell her she was wrong to publicly shame me, but I was also wrong to plan such a calculated revenge campaign instead of just ending things. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote several drafts trying to strike the right tone. I didn't want to let her completely off the hook for her behavior, but I also needed to take responsibility for my own actions. The first draft was too angry and defensive. The second was too apologetic and made it seem like everything was my fault. The third was too cold and formal, like a business letter. Eventually, I realized there was no perfect way to say it, so I just sent a simple text. I apologized for the cruelty of my methods while standing by my right to defend myself against her public shaming. I hit send before I could overthink it anymore. Tiffany responded a few hours later with her own apology. She said she was sorry for the public shaming and the constant comparisons to other boyfriends. She admitted she was insecure and materialistic during our relationship, and she recognized that now. Her text said we brought out the worst in each other, and we should both be glad the relationship ended before things got even uglier. I read her message twice and then responded agreeing with her assessment. We texted back and forth for about 20 minutes, having the most honest conversation we'd had in months. We both acknowledged that we were toxic together, even if we weren't necessarily toxic people individually. The conversation didn't fix anything or change what happened, but it felt like we were finally being real with each other, instead of playing games or trying to win arguments. When the conversation ended, I felt this weird sense of relief, like I could finally close that chapter of my life and actually move forward. The apology thing didn't magically fix what happened between us, but it gave me something I needed without realizing it. I could finally look back at the whole relationship without feeling angry or defensive about every single moment. The beginning was actually good when we first started dating, and she seemed sweet and fun to be around. Then somewhere along the way, things shifted, and she became obsessed with what her friends had and what their boyfriends bought them. The public shaming started small with little comments here and there, then grew into full performances in front of strangers designed to embarrass me into opening my wallet. My revenge campaign came from the same place her shaming did, just flipped around. She felt insecure about money and status and took it out on me publicly. I felt worthless and attacked, so I took it out on her publicly. We were both wrong in different ways that fed off each other until the whole thing exploded at that restaurant. Vladimir caught me at work the next week during lunch break and asked what I learned from everything that went down with Tiffany. I sat there chewing my sandwich trying to figure out how to explain it. Being right about her behavior doesn't mean my response was okay. She was definitely wrong to shame me publicly for months about not spending enough money on her. But I was also wrong to plan out this whole revenge thing where I humiliated her in increasingly nasty ways at restaurants and parties and stores. Two wrongs don't make a right. They just make both people look bad and drag innocent people into the mess. Jax and Chloe got caught in the middle of our war at that double-date dinner. Other friends had to pick sides or stay quiet while we trashed each other. Vladimir nodded and said that's the hard part about breakups, recognizing your own mistakes even when the other person started it. That conversation stuck with me for days, and I started thinking about my next relationship whenever that happens. What kind of boyfriend do I want to be, and what warning signs do I need to watch for in the women I date? The public shaming should have been an immediate deal-breaker the first time Tiffany did it. Instead, I stayed and hoped she would change or realize how her words affected me. I made excuses for her behavior and told myself she was just stressed or having a bad day. The resentment built up inside me for months until I finally snapped and decided to hurt her back. Next time, I'll have the guts to end things at the first sign of disrespect instead of letting it pile up until I turn into someone cruel. I'll look for someone who shares my values about money and doesn't need constant, expensive gifts to feel loved. Someone who contributes to the relationship instead of just taking and comparing me to other guys. 2 weeks later, I ran into Tiffany at a mutual friend's birthday party at some bar downtown. My stomach dropped when I walked in and saw her standing by the pool table with Dakota. She noticed me at the same time, and we both froze for a second. Jax was with me, and he squeezed my shoulder like he was ready to leave if I needed to bail. But Tiffany just gave me a small nod and turned back to her conversation. We stayed on opposite sides of the party for the first hour, both pretending the other person didn't exist. Eventually, I went to get another beer, and she was at the bar waiting for drinks. We made eye contact, and she said hi in this quiet voice. I said hi back and asked how she was doing. She said she was okay and asked about me. We had maybe 3 minutes of polite small talk about work and life. Nothing deep or emotional. Just two people who used to date acknowledging each other without starting drama. When her drinks came, she said it was good to see me and walked back to Dakota. The whole interaction felt like progress somehow. After the party, Jax drove me home and said he was relieved Tiffany and I could be in the same room without starting World War III. He told me the past few weeks were stressful for everyone in our friend group because nobody knew if social events would turn into battlegrounds. People were nervous about inviting both of us to things or worried we'd make scenes and ruin parties. I felt bad hearing that because I never thought about how our toxic relationship affected the people around us. I apologized for putting him and everyone else in that awful position. Jack said he stuck by me because we're friends, but he was glad I seemed to be handling things better now. I thanked him for not bailing on me even when he thought I was being an idiot with the revenge campaign. He laughed and said that's what friends do. They tell you when you're screwing up and hope you listen eventually. One night I was sitting alone in my apartment drinking a beer, and suddenly something clicked in my brain. The revenge campaign was never really about teaching Tiffany a lesson or making her understand how public shaming felt. It was about making myself feel powerful after months of feeling small and worthless. Every time she called me cheap in front of strangers or compared me to other boyfriends, I felt like I wasn't good enough. Humiliating her publicly was my way of proving I had control and wasn't some pathetic guy who would take her abuse forever. Understanding my own reasons doesn't excuse what I did, but it helps me see patterns I need to work on. I have this need to prove myself when I feel attacked, instead of just walking away from bad situations. Next relationship, I need to recognize that pattern early and handle it better. Vladimir brought his cousin Pierre to happy hour one Friday and introduced us. Pierre just went through a messy breakup where he did some petty revenge stuff too. We bonded over drinks about the stupid things people do when relationships go wrong and emotions take over. Pierre told me he slashed his ex's tires after she cheated on him, then felt hollow and stupid afterward when he had to pay for new tires as part of a police settlement. The revenge felt satisfying for maybe 5 minutes, then just made everything worse. We both agreed that breakups bring out sides of people they didn't know existed. The key is learning from those ugly moments instead of repeating the same mistakes with the next person. Pierre said his therapist told him revenge is about trying to transfer your pain onto someone else, but it never actually makes you feel better. I thought about that a lot after happy hour ended. I started putting real effort into saving money for that apartment I mentioned to Tiffany back when we were together. Without the constant stress of relationship drama, I found it way easier to manage my finances and stick to a budget. The savings account grew steadily each month, and I felt proud of my discipline. It's funny because Tiffany's main complaint was that I was too cheap and didn't want to spend money on her. But I wasn't cheap, I was responsible and planning for the future. She just couldn't see past her need for expensive gifts and designer stuff. I should have found a partner who appreciated my financial goals instead of trying to change someone who had completely different values. Every time I checked my bank account and saw the balance going up, I felt vindicated in a way the revenge campaign never made me feel. 3 months after the breakup, I was in a much better headspace. I could look back at the whole situation with more distance and less raw emotion. The relationship was doomed from the start because Tiffany and I had completely different values about money, status, and how partners should treat each other. She needed expensive things to feel valued and loved. I needed respect and partnership and someone who contributed equally. The public shaming and revenge campaign were just ugly symptoms of deeper problems we both ignored. We stayed together because the physical attraction was strong, and the early days were fun before her materialism took over. But attraction and fun aren't enough to build a real relationship when the core values don't match up. We should have ended things way earlier instead of letting it get so toxic. I was scrolling through Instagram one night and saw that Tiffany was dating someone new. There was a photo of her with some guy at a fancy restaurant, both of them smiling at the camera. I waited for the jealousy or bitterness to hit me, but it never came. Good for her, honestly. Hopefully she learned something from our toxic mess and treats this guy better than she treated me. I hope he has enough money to keep her happy, or enough backbone to set boundaries when she starts comparing him to other boyfriends. Because she'll definitely do that again unless she's done serious work on herself in therapy. Part of me doubts she changed that much in 3 months, but maybe the new guy is rich enough that her materialism won't be an issue. Either way, it's not my problem anymore, and I can move on with my life without worrying about what Tiffany is doing or who she's dating. A couple weeks later, Jax called me up and asked if I wanted to go on a double date with him and Chloe. They had this friend of Chloe's named Gracie who was single and looking to meet someone, and they thought we might hit it off. I said sure because enough time had passed that I felt ready to try dating again, even though part of me was nervous about jumping back in. We met at this Italian place downtown, and Gracie seemed nice right away, with an easy smile and a normal conversation style that didn't involve complaining about anything. She worked as a dental hygienist and talked about her job in a way that made it sound interesting instead of boring. When the waiter brought menus, I caught myself watching to see if she'd order the most expensive thing on the menu, and I realized I was being unfair to her. She ordered something middle range and didn't make a big deal about anything, just chatted normally with all of us about movies and weekend plans. The whole dinner I kept waiting for some sign that she was materialistic or judgmental about money, scanning everything she said for red flags that probably weren't there. When the check came, she pulled out her wallet without being asked and suggested we split it down the middle, and I felt relieved but also guilty for expecting problems that didn't exist. After dinner, we walked around downtown for a bit, and Gracie mentioned she was saving up for a trip to visit her sister in Colorado, and I found myself relaxing because she clearly had her own financial goals and priorities. We exchanged numbers at the end of the night and agreed to hang out again, and I drove home thinking about how I was bringing baggage from Tiffany into situations with women who hadn't done anything wrong. It wasn't fair to judge Gracie based on my ex's behavior, and I needed to give new people a fair chance instead of assuming the worst. At work the next week, my supervisor pulled me aside and asked if I'd be interested in taking on more responsibility and possibly training for a higher-level electrician certification. The company would pay for the training and I'd get a raise once I completed it, which sounded great for my career and my savings goals. I told him I was definitely interested, and we talked about the timeline and what the certification process would involve. Focusing on work goals felt productive in a way that the revenge campaign against Tiffany never did, like I was actually building something instead of just tearing someone else down. Over the next few days, I researched the certification requirements and started planning out how I'd balance the training with my regular work schedule. The raise that would come with the new certification meant I could save for that apartment even faster, and I felt proud of myself for staying focused on my actual goals instead of getting distracted by drama. Vladimir noticed I seemed more energized at work, and I told him about the certification opportunity, and he said it was good to see me investing in my future again. I realized that during the worst parts of the Tiffany situation, I'd let my career stuff slide because I was so focused on the relationship drama, and that was a mistake I wouldn't make again. The certification would take about 6 months to complete, but it was worth it for the career advancement and financial benefits, and it gave me something concrete to work toward. Dakota texted me out of nowhere one afternoon and asked if we could talk. I was surprised because I figured she hated me after everything that went down with Tiffany, but I agreed to meet her for coffee. She showed up looking uncomfortable and started by apologizing for the harsh things she'd said to me right after the restaurant incident. She admitted she'd only heard Tiffany's side of the story at that point and judged me unfairly without knowing the full context of what had been happening. I appreciated the apology and told her I understood she was just being a loyal friend to Tiffany, which is what good friends do. Dakota said she'd talked to some mutual friends and heard about the public shaming Tiffany had been doing to me for months, and she realized the situation was way more complicated than Tiffany had made it sound. We agreed that the whole thing was messy, and everyone involved made mistakes, including both Tiffany and me. Dakota mentioned that Tiffany had been doing some thinking about her behavior too, and wasn't just playing the victim anymore. I told Dakota I was glad to hear that because it meant maybe we'd both learn something from the disaster. The conversation felt good because it showed that people could move past the initial drama and see things more clearly with some distance. Dakota and I weren't going to be close friends, but at least we could be civil, and that felt like progress. I went on a second date with Gracie the following weekend, and then a third date a week after that. We were taking things slow, which felt healthy after the intensity of the Tiffany relationship. Gracie had her own career and her own money, and paid for herself on dates without making it some big statement or test. She didn't compare me to other guys or post about our relationship on social media, which was refreshing after dealing with Tiffany's constant need for validation. When we went to movies, she'd buy her own ticket, and when we got dinner, she'd either split the check or take turns paying without keeping score. The difference between dating someone secure and dating someone insecure was night and day. Gracie talked about her life and her interests without needing constant reassurance that she was special or valuable. She didn't need expensive gifts to feel loved or public displays to prove our relationship was real. We just hung out and enjoyed each other's company without all the drama and pressure. I found myself actually relaxing on dates instead of being on guard for the next public humiliation or demand for proof of my feelings. Gracie mentioned she'd been in a toxic relationship before and learned what she didn't want in a partner, and I told her I could relate to that completely. We were both taking our time and being careful, which seemed smart after we'd both been burned before. My phone buzzed one evening with a text from Tiffany asking if we could meet for coffee. She said she wanted to have a real conversation about what went wrong in our relationship. I stared at the message for a while, trying to decide if meeting up was a good idea or just reopening old wounds. Eventually, I agreed because I was curious what she wanted to say and figured we were both mature enough to handle a conversation. We met at a neutral coffee shop the next day, and Tiffany looked different, less made up and more natural than when we were dating. She started by telling me she'd been in therapy for the past couple months working on her materialism and insecurity issues. She said her therapist helped her understand that her constant need for expensive things came from feeling like she wasn't valuable on her own. Tiffany apologized for the public shaming and admitted that her behavior was emotionally abusive, which shocked me because she'd never taken responsibility like that before. She said she understood now that constantly putting me down in front of others was cruel and wrong, regardless of how she felt about money or gifts. I sat there listening and feeling genuinely surprised that she was doing this kind of self-reflection and growth work. I told Tiffany I was impressed she was taking therapy seriously and working on herself. Then I gave her my own apology for the calculated revenge campaign I'd put her through. I admitted that planning out ways to publicly humiliate her was cruel and vindictive, even if I felt justified at the time. We had an honest conversation about how we both handled things badly and brought out the worst in each other. Tiffany said she could see now how her constant shaming would make anyone angry and defensive, and I said I could see how my revenge made everything worse instead of better. We actually laughed a little bit about some of the ridiculous incidents, like the spreadsheet war and the restaurant standoffs. It felt good to acknowledge how absurd the whole situation had gotten without the anger and hurt that was there before. Tiffany mentioned that her new boyfriend was helping her see relationships differently, and I told her I was seeing someone too who was way more compatible with me. We both agreed we were completely wrong for each other and should have ended things way earlier before it got so toxic. The conversation lasted about an hour, and by the end I felt like we'd both gotten real closure. We weren't going to be friends, but we could be civil adults who learned from their mistakes. After meeting with Tiffany, I felt lighter walking back to my car. We were never getting back together, and we weren't going to hang out as friends, but we could acknowledge each other's humanity and move on without bitterness. The revenge campaign was a mistake I regretted, but it came from real hurt and frustration that I didn't know how to handle in a healthy way at the time. I was learning and growing from the experience, which is all anyone can do after making mistakes. The whole situation taught me things about myself I needed to know, like how I handle conflict and what my boundaries should be. I realized I'd let things build up with Tiffany instead of addressing problems early, and then I'd exploded in the worst possible way. Next time, I'd communicate better and walk away sooner if someone consistently disrespected me. The closure conversation with Tiffany felt like the final chapter of that drama closing, and I could focus fully on moving forward with my life and my new relationship with Gracie. Gracie and I had been dating for about a month when she asked me about my last relationship. I decided to be honest with her about the revenge campaign and how I wasn't proud of my behavior. I told her the whole story about Tiffany's public shaming and my calculated retaliation, not leaving out the ugly parts. Gracie listened without judging, and then shared her own story about a toxic relationship, where she'd also acted in ways she regretted. She said her ex had cheated on her, and she'd responded by posting all his private messages online and telling everyone he knew what he'd done. She felt justified at the time, but looking back, she wished she'd just walked away with dignity. We bonded over the shared experience of learning from past mistakes and trying to be better partners in future relationships. Gracie said she appreciated my honesty, and it made her trust me more, not less. I felt relieved that I could be open about my past without her running away or judging me too harshly. We agreed that everyone does stupid things when they're hurt, and what matters is learning from those moments. The conversation made me feel hopeful about where things might go with Gracie because we could be real with each other about our flaws and mistakes. I ran into Willow and Kirk at a restaurant a few weeks later, and they invited me to sit with them for a drink. Willow mentioned she'd heard that Tiffany and I had met up for coffee, and she was glad we'd been able to have that closure conversation. She said Tiffany seemed much happier and more self-aware now than she'd been during our relationship. I told them I was doing well too, and seeing someone new, and we had a pleasant conversation about life and work that felt normal and friendly. Kirk talked about their wedding plans and asked if I'd be comfortable coming since Tiffany would be there with her boyfriend. I said I'd be fine with it because Tiffany and I had moved past the drama. The fact that I could sit and have drinks with Tiffany's sister and her fiancé without any awkwardness felt like a sign that I'd really moved on. Willow said she was happy both Tiffany and I had found better matches and learned from the experience. We finished our drinks and said goodbye, and I drove home thinking about how far everyone had come since that engagement party, where everything started going downhill. Vladimir caught me at work the next day and said he was proud of how I'd handled the aftermath of the breakup. He said I'd turned a toxic situation into an opportunity for growth instead of just staying bitter and angry. I thanked him for being a good friend and calling me out when I needed it, even when I didn't want to hear it. Vladimir said that's what real friends do. They support you, but they also tell you when you're being an idiot. I laughed and agreed I'd definitely been an idiot during the revenge campaign phase. He asked about Gracie, and I told him things were going really well, that we were taking it slow and building something healthy. Vladimir said he could tell I was in a better headspace because I wasn't constantly stressed and angry like I'd been during the Tiffany situation. I realized he was right, that I felt more like myself again without all that relationship drama weighing me down. We got back to work, but I spent the rest of the day feeling grateful for friends who stuck by me through my worst moments and helped me become better. 6 months passed and I barely recognized the person I'd been during the Tiffany mess. I sat at my desk at work looking at my savings account balance and felt proud instead of angry. The number kept growing every week because I wasn't spending money trying to prove points or planning revenge campaigns. I was just living my life and putting away cash for that apartment I'd been talking about forever. Gracie texted me asking what time I'd pick her up for dinner, and I smiled at my phone like an idiot. Dating her was so easy compared to the constant fighting and drama with Tiffany. We split bills without discussing it. We bought each other small, thoughtful gifts instead of keeping score, and she never once made me feel bad about my job or my income. The whole Tiffany situation felt like it happened to someone else, like I was watching a movie about a guy who got so caught up in anger that he forgot what actually mattered. I couldn't even remember what that burning need for revenge felt like anymore. My phone buzzed with a work email, and I handled it quickly before heading out to meet Gracie. Life was good and simple and drama-free, exactly what I needed after months of toxic chaos. The wedding invitation came from a mutual friend, and I almost didn't go because I knew Tiffany would be there. Gracie convinced me it would be fine, and she was right. I spotted Tiffany across the church during the ceremony, and she looked different, lighter somehow, like she wasn't carrying around all that anger and entitlement anymore. After the ceremony ended, I walked over to congratulate the bride, and Tiffany was standing right there with some guy I didn't recognize. She smiled when she saw me, and it wasn't fake or forced, just a normal, friendly smile. She introduced me to her boyfriend, Julius, and shook Gracie's hand when I introduced them. We stood there making small talk about the wedding and the weather, and it felt totally normal, like we were just two people who happened to know each other instead of two people who'd publicly destroyed each other 6 months ago. Julius seemed like a decent guy, quiet and polite, and he had his arm around Tiffany's waist in a way that looked comfortable and natural. Tiffany asked how I was doing, and I told her about the apartment I was close to buying, and she genuinely seemed happy for me. She mentioned she'd gotten a new job at a marketing firm and was doing really well. We talked for maybe 5 minutes total before other guests came over, and we drifted apart. The whole interaction felt warm and friendly, nothing like the cold, angry exchanges we'd had during the breakup. I realized standing there that we were both happier now with different people, and maybe the toxic relationship had taught us both what we didn't want. At the reception, I grabbed drinks with Gracie, and we found our table near the dance floor. The DJ started playing upbeat music and couples filled the floor. I spotted Tiffany dancing with Julius and watched them for a minute. She was laughing at something he said and spinning around in her dress, looking relaxed and happy. Julius pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and she smiled up at him like he'd just given her the world. I felt genuinely happy watching them instead of bitter or jealous. She looked different with Julius than she ever looked with me, less tense and worried about impressing people or keeping up with her friends. Her whole body language was different, open and comfortable instead of rigid and defensive. Julius seemed content just being with her, not stressed about money or gifts or living up to some impossible standard. I hoped she'd learned from our mistakes and wasn't putting pressure on him about expensive things or comparing him to other guys. I hoped Julius was secure enough to set boundaries if she started that behavior again. Mostly, I just hoped they were both happy and treating each other with actual respect instead of the toxic pattern Tiffany and I had fallen into. Gracie squeezed my hand and asked if I wanted to dance, pulling me onto the floor before I could answer. Later that night, Gracie and I were driving home and she asked me about Tiffany. I could tell she'd been thinking about it all evening, watching how Tiffany and I interacted at the wedding. I took a deep breath and told her everything, the whole ugly story from start to finish. I explained how Tiffany used to publicly shame me about money in stores and restaurants, making me feel worthless and cheap in front of strangers. I told her about my revenge campaign, how I'd planned out ways to humiliate Tiffany publicly and make her feel what I'd felt. I described the restaurant incident where I left Tiffany's portion of the bill unpaid in front of our friends and how satisfied I'd felt watching her scramble to pay. Gracie listened without interrupting or judging, just nodding occasionally to show she was following along. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute before saying she could see how much I'd grown since then. She said the guy who planned revenge campaigns didn't sound like the guy sitting next to her now. I told her I was committed to handling things differently in our relationship, that I'd learned public shaming and revenge just made everything worse. I promised no revenge campaigns, no public humiliation, just honest talking and the guts to walk away if things got toxic. Gracie said she was committed to the same approach and we should hold each other to it. She reached over and held my hand while I drove, and I felt grateful she didn't run away after hearing about my worst moments. That night I couldn't sleep and kept thinking about what I'd tell my past self if I could go back to the start of the Tiffany relationship. I'd tell him to end things the first time she publicly shamed him about money instead of hoping she'd change or making excuses for her behavior. I'd explain that revenge feels good in the moment, but leaves you empty and full of regret afterward, that humiliating someone else doesn't actually heal the hurt they caused you. I'd tell him the right person won't make you feel small or worthless no matter how much money you spend or don't spend. I'd say it's better to be alone and working on yourself than stuck in a relationship that brings out your worst qualities and turns you into someone cruel. I'd warn him that planning revenge campaigns takes time and energy that could go toward building something good instead of tearing someone else down. I'd tell him to just walk away with his dignity intact instead of stooping to her level and becoming the thing he hated. But I couldn't go back and tell my past self anything, so I just had to accept that I'd made mistakes and learn from them the hard way. I rolled over and put my arm around Gracie, grateful I'd found someone who brought out better parts of me instead of worse ones. Jax came over the next weekend to watch the game and drink beer on my couch. During halftime, he muted the TV and told me he was amazed at how much I'd changed in 6 months. He said the guy who left Tiffany's bill unpaid at that restaurant seemed angry and mean, but now I seemed calm and happy. I told him the whole Tiffany situation taught me stuff about setting boundaries and handling problems in relationships without going nuclear. I explained that I'd learned to recognize when I was getting resentful and address it directly instead of letting it build until I exploded. Jack said he was glad I learned those lessons, but wished I could have figured it out without the revenge campaign drama that made everyone uncomfortable. I agreed completely and told him I regretted how I handled things, even though Tiffany's behavior was wrong too. He asked about Gracie, and I told him things were going really well, that we communicated honestly and treated each other with actual respect. Jack said he could tell I was in a better place mentally because I wasn't constantly stressed and angry like during the Tiffany months. We unmuted the game and went back to watching, but I kept thinking about how lucky I was to have friends who stuck around even when I was being an idiot. The call came from my realtor on a Tuesday morning while I was at a job site. She told me my offer on the apartment had been accepted and we could close in 3 weeks. I actually yelled with excitement right there in front of my coworkers, and Vladimir gave me a high five. The apartment represented everything I'd been working toward, all the financial planning and saving I'd maintained even during the chaos of the breakup. I'd kept putting money away week after week instead of spending it on expensive gifts or revenge schemes. Closing on the place felt like proof that I'd stayed focused on my real goals instead of getting completely lost in relationship drama. Gracie came with me to the closing and held my hand while I signed all the papers. Afterward, we drove to the empty apartment and walked through the rooms planning where furniture would go. She mentioned maybe moving in eventually if things kept going well between us, and I liked how she said it, casual and honest instead of demanding or manipulative. The apartment was mine, bought with money I'd earned and saved on my own terms. It wasn't about proving anything to Tiffany or meeting someone else's standards. It was just a good, solid place to build the life I actually wanted. I invited everyone over for a housewarming party the following Saturday. Vladimir showed up first with a bottle of wine and helped me set up the grill on my new balcony. Jax and Chloe arrived next with burgers and hot dogs, and a few other friends from work trickled in over the next hour. The vibe was relaxed and happy, totally different from the tension that used to hang over our friend group during the breakup period. We grilled food and drank beer and told stupid stories, laughing about random stuff that had nothing to do with relationship drama. Chloe mentioned how nice it was to hang out without walking on eggshells or worrying about someone starting a fight. Vladimir raised his beer and made a toast to new beginnings and leaving toxic situations in the past. Everyone clinked bottles, and I felt this wave of gratitude for friends who'd stuck by me, even when I was acting like a jerk. The party went late into the night with people sitting on my balcony watching the city lights and just enjoying each other's company. When everyone finally left and I was cleaning up alone, I looked around my apartment and felt proud of what I'd built. Gracie started staying over more nights than not, and we fell into an easy routine. She'd cook dinner while I cleaned up the kitchen, we'd watch shows on the couch, she'd steal my hoodies and leave her stuff scattered around my bathroom. Dating her felt simple in the best way, no drama or fighting or keeping score about who paid for what. We split everything fairly without discussing it or making spreadsheets to track contributions. She never compared me to other guys or posted about our relationship on social media for validation. When we disagreed about something, we just talked about it like adults instead of attacking each other publicly. The difference between this relationship and the Tiffany disaster was night and day. I'd wasted so much energy on that toxic situation, planning revenge and documenting her spending and trying to prove I was right. With Gracie, I just focused on being a good partner and building something healthy. We started talking about long-term plans, where we wanted to live eventually and what we wanted out of life. She mentioned wanting kids someday, and I realized I could actually picture that future with her, something I never felt with Tiffany, despite dating her longer. I ran into Tiffany at the grocery store on a random Thursday evening. She was in the produce section picking out apples when I turned the corner with my cart. We both stopped and smiled, and it didn't feel awkward at all. She asked how the new apartment was working out, and I told her it was great, that I'd just had a housewarming party. I asked about her job, and she said the marketing firm was going well. She'd just gotten assigned to a big account. We stood there chatting for a few minutes about normal everyday stuff, no tension or hidden meanings. She told me she was happy with Julius and things were going really well. I told her I was happy too and dating someone great. She said she was glad we could both move on and find better matches, people who brought out good parts of us instead of bad ones. I agreed, and we stood there for another minute just smiling at each other. Then she said she needed to get going and wished me well, and I did the same. We went our separate ways down different aisles, and I felt this sense of peace about the whole thing. The revenge campaign was a mistake I'd always regret, but it was part of a messy journey that taught me what I actually needed in a partner. Tiffany and I had both grown into better versions of ourselves since the breakup, and sometimes that's the best possible ending to a bad situation. I spent the next few months really thinking about what went wrong with Tiffany and me, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that we just brought out terrible things in each other. Her need to show off and buy expensive stuff made me defensive and angry, and my careful approach to money made her feel like I didn't care about her. We were wrong for each other from the start, but we stayed together anyway, hurting each other worse and worse until everything blew up in that restaurant with our friends watching. Looking back, I should have ended things the first time she embarrassed me in public instead of planning revenge and keeping score. She should have left when she realized I wasn't going to be the big spender boyfriend she wanted. Instead, we both stayed and made each other miserable, competing to see who could hurt the other person more publicly. The whole revenge campaign was stupid and mean, and even though she started the public shaming, I made it worse by planning out ways to humiliate her. Two wrongs definitely didn't make a right. They just made both of us look bad and put our friends in awkward positions where they had to pick sides. Dating Gracie taught me what a healthy relationship actually looks like, and I realized how much the Tiffany situation messed with my head. With Gracie, I don't keep spreadsheets or plan revenge or worry about being embarrassed in stores. We just talk about stuff like normal adults, and if something bothers one of us, we say it directly instead of attacking each other publicly. I notice my triggers now, like when I start feeling defensive about money, or when I'm tempted to keep score about who paid for what. I stop myself and actually communicate instead of letting anger build up until I explode. The revenge campaign is something I'll always regret because it was cruel and calculated, but at least I learned from it and became a better partner. I know now that being right doesn't give you permission to be mean, and that proving a point isn't worth destroying your own character. Gracie helped me see that relationships should make you want to be better, not bring out your worst qualities. My life now is completely different from those toxic months with Tiffany. I've got my apartment that I saved for and worked hard to afford, and it feels amazing to have my own space that represents my goals and values. Gracie and I are building something real and healthy, with actual communication and respect instead of public fights and scorekeeping. My friends stuck by me even when I was acting like a jerk, and I'm grateful for people like Jax and Vladimir who called me out when I needed it. Work is going great, and I'm proud of my career as an electrician. Proud that I'm good at what I do and that I manage my money responsibly. The whole revenge thing taught me that the best way to deal with a bad relationship isn't to destroy the other person publicly. It's to just walk away and build a better life. Tiffany and I are both happier now than we ever were together, and I'm glad we eventually apologized to each other and got closure. She's with someone who probably appreciates her differently than I did, and I'm with someone who values the same things I do. Sometimes relationships fail because people are fundamentally wrong for each other, and the mature thing is to recognize that and move on without bitterness.